Hello again, Steve here with a few comments about what I talked about before. Just not that I know much about it really, but it's an interesting thing to me. This thing called the Trivium. The Trivium was or is a concept that in order to form rhetoric, we must have grammar and logic. So the Trivium then three, right, was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Now, I like to use an analogy for this to sort of explain why this is important for the quality of our life experience. So if we had a simple equation, right? If we had a simple equation like 1 plus 2 is equal to 3, what we see there in relation to the trivium is the grammar would be the structure we use to get the symbology, the symbols, the sounds, the symbols and so on that we use to portray an idea, right? An abstract idea, which is what that is. Now we're having a 1 and we're having a 2 and we're having a plus and an equal and all that. That's the symbology. And if we're talking at the sounds, that would be grammar, right? When we make a sentence, we use sounds. I am talking, right? It's grammar to create something in the in words, right? Portray an idea. Now, the logic is how we flow through, right? So if I was to say, for example, 1 plus 1 is equal to 3, you'd automatically say that's illogical, right? Because it doesn't, even though it has grammar in there, even though it has the structure of that equation, it doesn't flow logically. And the rhetoric, what rhetoric is the conclusion based on logic. So you could say if somebody was to say 1 plus 1 is equal to 3, and their rhetoric that they hold to is 3, you can say that's false rhetoric for the logic that's there. And I think the reason why this is important is a lot of times in society, we often jump to our rhetoric, or what we think is rhetoric. Often it's not rhetoric, but we think it's rhetoric. Or it is our rhetoric, but it's false rhetoric because we haven't actually worked through the logic of it very carefully. And this is very true with mysticism and religions and so on, and government and all this falsehood that we talk about. Is we haven't worked it through. We haven't worked the equations through. Things didn't add up. We don't have a full equation adding up to that equal sign. We don't have consistency. And a lot of times we jump right through. And sometimes we think that stuff is rhetoric, but it's not actually rhetoric, it's more indoctrination, right? So if we were always just told that, 4 apples is actually 5 apples, and we've always been told that, and we didn't stop to use our sense of logic, then we would go around talking as though that's true, but it wouldn't really be rhetoric. We would think it's rhetoric, we would think that it is the truth, or that it's logical or whatever, but it's not. If we were to stop and think about it, using our grammar, using our logic, we'd realize that that was false. And I think this happens a lot. It's, what happens a lot, I think, especially in terms of concepts like government, is we talk about it as though it is something, right? Whereas if we just looked at the equation, what we'd see is just a bunch of people. And how it is that we jump to this other entity, there's no framework within our logic for that. We cannot get from the people to this fantastical idea. It's the same concept with what we fantasize as gods, right? And this is why I think every culture has a different concept of it. But they don't have a different concept in basic in the fundamentals of what a man is and what a woman is. They don't, because they can't delude themselves about that, right? But the concept of what a god is vastly different in terms of its powers and its concepts and its how it looks in the minds of people and the way they do their art and so on. It's all a little bit different because it doesn't follow any logical sequence. So I think it's important for us because it helps us to come back to a very basic understanding. It helps us with getting to conclusions to rhetoric that's more clear for ourselves, about others, about our world, and so on. And I suspect the reason why, so-called education systems for young people don't teach this stuff anymore is because I think they don't really want people to figure things out. The system, a control system, wants to implant pseudo-rhetoric into people and dress it up as the truth and hope like hell they don't actually figure out how to use the little bits of grammar that is given to them and apply that to logic to figure it out for themselves en masse. Because if they do, there's big trouble. Because all of a sudden, people realize that what they've been told all their life is, something equivalent to 1 plus 2 is equal to 7, because they jumped all kinds of steps into this pseudo fantasy land called government, gods, and deities, and uh, nonsense and illogical conclusions and taught that that's real. But when we follow it through and we realize that, wait a minute, where did this queen thing come from? Why is she's just a woman? Like, why does she? How did we get to that? She's somehow divine, like divinely connected, or the Pope, he can talk to God and nobody else can. It's complete nonsense, right? When we look at nonsense, or it's non-logical, it's illogical when we follow it through, because at least I haven't found any way that it is logical, or I mean, it's almost as silly as somebody saying, well, yeah, actually 1 plus 2 is equal to 5. I could honestly say, well, maybe it is, but I mean, show me how that actually is true. So maybe all this stuff that the Pope is talking to God and so on and is all true, but show me. Like, it's just people saying so, right? People can say all kinds of shit, but if we try to follow their logic or their illogic, it doesn't arrive there. It could arrive anywhere. It could arrive at a yellow cheese man on the other side of Mars. It could be anywhere, because once you go off and just start making shit up, you can go anywhere. And of course, there's value to that in dreams and imagination and so on. But when we were very conscious, surely we can get to the point of saying, hey, I'm able to walk, so maybe there's a purpose for that. I'm able to use logical step procedures in mental constructs, so maybe there's a purpose to that, right? And I think one of the purposes to it is it just keeps us out of a lot of shit and a lot of bullshit, and protects us from, and makes things connect. It makes things connect better. We see things as existing within laws and in sequences, and according to predictability, as much as we can understand it. So I think it's important to understand that what rhetoric is. It's so simple when we think about it, right? We have these ways of putting things together in our minds. A lot of times it's words and it's symbols and so on. And the way we talk to people is that way, gestures or whatever. But ultimately, it's concrete ideas, right? A one and a one means a one of something, right? If I have 1 banana and take another 2 bananas, then I have 3 bananas. If somebody used to say, well, that's actually equal to 4 bananas, that would be incorrect rhetoric, right? So I think it's important to be able to, of course, it's not as clear as that, because 1 plus 2 is very, very clear. It's sort of an ideal situation. But we get into more complex situations, the rhetoric is a little bit more clever, the way things can be hidden from us and so on. But when we get into practice of it, just asking questions like, how does that add up? In other words, being a little bit skeptical of pretty much anything anybody says, until we work it back through, right? And see where they come from. Like, people say something, it's good times if they're trying, especially if they're trying to put something upon us, to ask questions. Well, how did you arrive at that? Like, what are you talking about? I mean, who said I had to pay taxes, right? Like, people get kind of scared when you ask those questions, but it's a good question to ask even in social circles, and especially in social circles, because we engage in conversations that really matter. We're being honest to our friends and so on, because we're not just going along anymore with this false rhetoric. And where is this coming from, right? Where is this concept of just because you're born in a geographic region, somebody has dominion over you? Where is this coming from? Like, how did you figure that out? Other than somebody told you that is. See, there's lots of false dogmas and propaganda and so on. There's all kinds of that shit around. But does it make any sense? The only sense that, if you think about it, that we have to be subjected to somebody's dictates or whatever is if we agree to it, right? Like, for example, if you go to work for somebody, you agree that, hey, you're going to perform a task, they're going to pay you. So now if they come along and say, I want you to do this today, well, they have dominion over you in a way, but there's a deal there. There's a deal that I will do, within this boundary of job descriptions. I will do those things, and you're going to pay me, right? But if somebody just comes along, just because you're born somewhere, and all of a sudden you grow up and somebody starts telling you, this old hag called a queen has dominion over you. Oh, hang on a second here. Like, how does that make any sense? See, there's no equation, right? See, the equation would be something like this. Myself and another person, plus an agreement, right? That's why there's such a thing as rape, right? If you have a man and a woman and no agreement to have sex, it's called rape. But if it's an agreement to have sex, it's the same act going on. But you see the equation there. There's a joinder somehow. There's an equator, right? And then it's consensual. It's sex. It's fun. It's whatever, procreation, whatever it happens to be. But it's agreed upon. So it's just what it is at that point. We have these innate tendencies within us. We kind of know what's correct and what's logical and what's not. It's just that it's been beat out of us so many times that it's almost dangerous to visit them anymore. So we have this tendency to just kind of put that aside. Oh, queen, your honor, most rightfully, whatever they call them, honorable, most honorable, and all these. I mean, that's another interesting thing is, where did honorable come from? If you're just saying that I have to obey you, that isn't very. I don't see it as very honorable. But I think that these things are important to try to form our own rhetoric, and certainly, for me anyway, that helps to improve the quality of my life experience, because I can say yes more often. I kind of get it, right? But if we don't, to me anyways, it's a feeling of almost lostness, or knowing there's a better answer, but not willing to admit it. It's kind of like self-denial. And that, to me, does not add to the quality of life, but it takes away from it for sure. Anyways, great chatting again. Steve here. Hope that was helpful. Just a little bit of a ramble. Wanted to get it off my chest. I wrote a note down, and hey, I wanted to share. So it's great talking again. Talk again soon. Bye for now.